A few days ago, the world was bracing for another major conflict in the Middle East. Oil traders were nervous. Military commanders were on alert. Shipping companies watched satellite maps of the Persian Gulf with growing concern, and governments across Europe, Asia, and North America were quietly preparing for the possibility that a regional war could trigger a global economic shock. Then, almost unexpectedly, came a breakthrough. According to multiple reports, the United States and Iran have agreed to a deal aimed at ending the latest phase of the conflict. Mediator Pakistan says the agreement is expected to be formally signed in Switzerland, offering the first real pathway away from a crisis that had threatened energy markets, military stability, and international trade. But beneath the headlines lies a much bigger story, because this isn't just about ending a war. It's about whether one of the world's most dangerous regions can avoid pulling the global economy into another period of uncertainty. The first signs of relief appeared almost immediately. U.S. stock markets surged higher after news of the agreement emerged. Oil prices, which had been climbing amid fears of disruption, began falling. Analysts who only days earlier warned of a prolonged energy shock suddenly started discussing the possibility that the worst-case scenario might be avoided. And at the center of those fears was a narrow stretch of water that carries enormous global significance: the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, massive tankers transport a significant portion of the world's oil through this strategic corridor between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Any threat to shipping in these waters can send shockwaves through global markets. For weeks, investors worried that escalating tensions could disrupt traffic through the strait. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump says ships are beginning to move again through the region. Yet even here, uncertainty remains. Analysis from BBC Verify suggests there has not yet been a dramatic increase in traffic levels. In other words, confidence may be returning, but the world shipping industry is still waiting to see whether the agreement will translate into lasting stability on the water. And that raises a critical question. What exactly has been agreed? One of the most important elements involves Lebanon. The deal reportedly includes an end to military operations in Lebanese territory. For Lebanon, a country that has spent decades trapped between regional rivalries, economic crises, and security challenges, the announcement was welcomed as a potential turning point. Iran has described the end of the conflict in Lebanon as an inseparable part of the agreement. That language is significant. It suggests Tehran views Lebanon not as a side issue but as a central component of the broader settlement. But this is where the story becomes far more complicated. Because while Lebanon has welcomed the agreement, Israel has made clear that its forces will remain in the country indefinitely. That position introduces a major source of uncertainty. If one side sees military withdrawal as essential to peace while another intends to maintain a military presence, the possibility of future friction remains very real, and history offers a warning. Many conflicts do not end because a document is signed. They end when all parties interpret that document in the same way. At the moment, that condition appears far from guaranteed. Security analysts note that agreements reached during periods of high tension often face their greatest test after the celebrations end and implementation begins. Questions remain unanswered. How will military activities be monitored? What happens if one side accuses another of violating the deal? Who guarantees compliance? And perhaps most importantly, what role will regional actors play once international attention moves elsewhere? These uncertainties explain why some experts remain cautious despite the positive headlines. The agreement may have reduced the immediate risk of escalation, but reducing risk is not the same as eliminating it. For the global economy, however, even temporary stability matters. Energy markets depend on predictability. Manufacturers depend on predictable energy costs. Consumers depend on predictable prices. When geopolitical tensions threaten oil supplies, the consequences can travel thousands of miles from the battlefield. A shipping disruption in the Middle East can eventually affect inflation, transportation costs, and economic growth across continents. That is why investors reacted so strongly to the news. Not because every problem has been solved, but because the possibility of a much larger crisis suddenly appears less likely. Still, the final outcome remains uncertain. Diplomatic breakthroughs often look strongest on the day they are announced. The real challenge comes afterward. In the coming weeks, attention will shift from negotiations to implementation, from promises to actions, and from headlines to realities on the ground. The world may be witnessing the beginning of a genuine de-escalation, or it may simply be witnessing a pause in a conflict whose underlying tensions remain unresolved. For now, markets are breathing easier, governments are cautiously optimistic, and a region long associated with instability has been given another chance at peace. But as ships slowly return to strategic waterways and diplomats prepare for signatures in Switzerland, one question still hangs over the entire agreement. Is this the end of a war, or merely the beginning of a far more complicated peace? Because the answer won't just shape the future of the Middle East, it could influence energy security, economic stability, and geopolitical strategy across the world for years to come.